He flew the Queen of England. He flew the Prime Minister of Canada. He commanded the country's largest Air Force base, thousands of personnel, every deployment order crossing his desk. He signed the letters of condolence, including one for a woman he had killed himself. Colonel Russell Williams wore the uniform for 23 years without a single blemish on his record. No arrests, no complaints. Not one flag in 23 years of security screening. And for the last 3 of those years, he was breaking into houses at night and photographing himself doing it. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. David Russell Williams was born in March 1963 in Bromsgrove, England, a market town in Worcestershire, unremarkable in every way. His father was a metallurgist. His mother worked as a lab technician. When he was 5, the family emigrated to Canada, drawn by a research posting at Chalk River, the nuclear facility on the Ottawa River in eastern Ontario. The marriage did not survive Chalk River. His parents divorced, and his mother remarried to a colleague of her husband's, a doctor named Jerry Sovka. The boy took his stepfather's surname for a time. He was known at school as Russ Sovka. Later, he would drop it entirely and go by his middle name, Russell Williams, a man who had already, before adolescence, changed what he was called and who he belonged to. He was sent to Birchmount Park Collegiate in Scarborough, then to Upper Canada College, the most prestigious private school in the country, the place where Canada sends the sons of judges and bankers. Classmates from that period remember almost nothing about him, not because he was unpleasant, because there was nothing to remember. He played squash, he was polite, he did not misbehave. He studied economics and politics at the University of Toronto, graduating in 1986. And then, at 24, he did something that surprised the few people who knew him. He enlisted. The Canadian Forces suited him precisely. The military offers a life in which every question has a documented answer, where merit is measured in checklists and flight hours, and where the correct behavior is written down in advance. Williams thrived. He earned his wings in 1990. He flew the CC-130 Hercules, then the CC-144 Challenger. The executive jet used to move Canada's most senior people. That is how he came to fly royalty. Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, the Governor General, Prime Ministers Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. He was, by every professional assessment, an exceptional pilot, smooth on the controls, obsessive about preparation, entirely unflappable. His career accelerated. He commanded Camp Mirage, the classified Canadian logistics base in the United Arab Emirates that supported the entire Afghanistan mission. He served as a director in Ottawa, working on Air Force projects at the national level. Then, in July 2009, he received the appointment that represented the top of the ladder for an officer his age, Commander of Canadian Forces Base Trenton. Trenton is the beating heart of Canadian military air operations. Every soldier deployed to Afghanistan flew out of Trenton, and every soldier killed in Afghanistan came home through Trenton in a flag-draped coffin down the Highway of Heroes toward Toronto. Williams stood on that tarmac in dress uniform for the repatriation ceremonies. He saluted the caskets, he met the families. He was by then married. Mary Elizabeth Harriman was a woman of substance in her own right, an executive at the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, intelligent, well-liked, deeply established in Ottawa professional circles. They had met at university. They married in 1991. They had no children. They owned a comfortable house on Wilkie Drive in Orleans, a suburb on the eastern edge of Ottawa, and a cottage 2 hours south in a village called Tweed. Colleagues describe a man who was cold, but never cruel. He kept a meticulous diary of his flight time. He ran. He logged his runs. He collected data about himself the way other people collect stamps. Subordinates found him distant, formal, precise, the sort of commander who corrected the margins on a memorandum. There were no affairs, no drinking, no debts, no temper. Investigators would later go looking for the crack in the surface. The childhood trauma, the head injury, the humiliation, the thing that explains it. They found nothing, no abuse, no violence in the home, no documented cruelty to animals, none of the standard markers. There was only the surface, and behind it, apparently, nothing at all. Tweed sits about 90 miles east of Toronto, inland from Lake Ontario, on the edge of the Canadian Shield, where the farmland gives out and the rock begins. Roughly 6,000 people, a main street, a hardware store, a lake, a lot of trees. The kind of place where people leave the porch light on and the side door unlocked, because everyone's cousin lives 4 doors down. Williams bought a cottage there on Cozy Cove Lane, a narrow road running down toward Stokoe Lake. He used it as a retreat from Ottawa. He would drive down alone, often midweek, while his wife stayed in the city. Neighbors knew him vaguely as the pilot. He mowed the lawn, he waved, he did not linger. In September 2007, a house 2 doors down from his own was entered while the family was away. Nothing was broken, no window smashed, no door forced. The homeowners came back to a house that looked exactly as they had left it, except that the drawers in a teenage girl's bedroom had been gone through and a quantity of her underwear was missing. There was no cash taken. A laptop sat untouched on the desk. Jewelry was still in the box. They reported it. The Ontario Provincial Police took the report. And then it went into a filing cabinet, because there is very little a rural police detachment can do with an unforced entry, no witnesses, and no fingerprints. That was the first one. It would not be the last. Over the next 28 months, Russell Williams broke into houses in Tweed and in Orleans, the Ottawa suburb where he lived, a total of 82 times. 47 of those entries were successful. In the others, he was interrupted, or a door failed to open, or a light came on and he walked away. The methodology was the same every time, and it was the methodology of a man trained in operational planning. He surveyed first. He identified houses occupied by women or teenage girls. He learned this from mailboxes, from laundry lines, from what he could see through a window. He established patterns of absence. He noted which properties backed onto woodland. He almost never entered by the front. He came through basement windows, unlocked side doors, patio sliders left open in the summer. He carried a flashlight and, later, a camera. Inside, he moved slowly. He was not rushed because he had established that nobody was home. He went through drawers and reordered them afterward so that the disturbance would not register. He took underwear, bras, panties, occasionally bathing suits, and he took them in quantity. In several homes, he returned 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a year. And then he documented everything. This is the part that separates the case from ordinary burglary. Williams photographed the interiors of the houses he entered. He photographed the drawers before and after. He photographed the items he took, laid out on beds. He photographed himself, wearing the stolen underwear, in the victim's own bedrooms, using the timer function on his camera or the mirror on the wall. His face is in many of these images. He made no attempt to conceal it, because the photographs were never going to be seen by anyone but him. He then went home and cataloged the material, folders, subfolders, named by address, by date, by victim. He compressed the image files to save disk space. He kept a written index. Some of the stolen items were stored in the rafters of his garage in sealed bags, tagged. He was building an archive of himself. For a long stretch, none of it surfaced. Some victims never realized they had been burgled at all. Who counts their underwear? Others assumed they had lost items in the wash, or that a teenage daughter had thrown something out. A few reported it, and the reports sat in separate detachments in separate jurisdictions, 2 hours apart, never connected. But by the summer of 2009, Tweed had begun to talk, because the pattern had become impossible to explain away. 3 houses on one road, then a 4th, always the same missing category of item, always no damage, no theft of value. In a village that size, that kind of information travels through the coffee shop and the arena and the church basement within days. People started locking their doors. Women who lived alone asked friends to stay over. There were rumors about a teenager doing it as a prank, rumors about a drifter, rumors about a man from out of town who had a cottage and was never around when you expected him to be. Somebody suggested it might be someone local, and the suggestion was resented because in Tweed, that meant suspecting a neighbor. What nobody in the village articulated, because there was no reason to, was the escalation curve underneath. Burglary had stopped being enough for him. The night of September 17th, 2009 was warm for the time of year. A woman in Tweed had gone to bed with her infant son in the house. She woke because someone was standing over her. He was wearing a hood. He told her not to look at him. He bound her, and then he blindfolded her, wrapping her head so completely that she could see nothing at all. She could hear him moving through the house. She could hear him in the room with her, breathing, unhurried. He photographed her. He assaulted her over a period of hours. Then he stopped and spoke to her about the baby. He asked whether the child would need to be fed. He told her that he was going to leave and that she should not call the police immediately, and he left her alive. 13 days later, on September 30th, he did it again. A different Tweed house, a different woman, the same hood, the same restraints, the same camera. He beat her. He assaulted her for hours. And, again, he made the deliberate decision not to kill her and walked out into the dark and drove away. Both women survived. Both went to the police within hours. And Tweed, which had spent 2 years worrying about a man who stole underwear, understood in the space of 2 weeks that it was dealing with something else entirely. The atmosphere in the village changed in a way that residents still describe with precision. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks. Men slept in chairs in their front rooms with shotguns across their knees. Women stopped walking the dog after dark. Parents drove their teenage daughters 2 blocks rather than let them walk. There was a run on motion sensor floodlights at the Home Hardware in Belleville. People who had never locked a door in 40 years began locking them, and then began checking them twice. And the suspicion turned inward, which is the particular poison of a small town under threat. Because the offender clearly knew the geography. He knew which houses were occupied by women. He knew when husbands worked nights. That is not knowledge a stranger passing through on Highway 37 possesses. So Tweed began looking sideways at Tweed. At the guy who did the snow plowing, at the meter reader, at the neighbor with the odd hours. Nobody looked at the Colonel's cottage on Cozy Cove Lane. It sat empty most of the week. He was, after all, in Ottawa, or in Trenton, or in Dubai. The Ontario Provincial Police opened a serious investigation. They had 2 surviving victims, which is normally a substantial advantage. But the advantage evaporated on contact with the facts of these particular attacks. Neither woman had seen his face. The blindfolding had been thorough and deliberate. This was not panic, it was procedure. Descriptions of build and height were approximate and did not match each other closely. He had left no fingerprints. He had worn gloves throughout. He had taken the bindings with him. He had been careful about biological evidence, and what forensic material was recovered produced no hit. Because to get a hit from a DNA database, the offender has to already be in the system. Russell Williams was not in the system. He had never been charged with anything in his life. He had never been arrested, never fingerprinted for cause, never so much as issued a serious traffic ticket. He held a top-secret security clearance that had been renewed repeatedly, involving background checks, financial reviews, and interviews with associates. Every one of those screenings had come back clean because there was nothing in the paper record to find. Investigators built the standard profile, and it pointed them in the standard direction. A local man, probably in his 20s or 30s, likely with a prior record for break-and-enter or sexual offenses, probably unemployed or in casual labor, probably known to police. They pulled the sex offender registry for the region. They canvassed. They interviewed men with priors across Hastings County. They looked hard at anyone with a history of voyeurism. They were describing a person who did not exist. The man they wanted was 46 years old, married, in command of 8,000 personnel, and on the mornings after both attacks, he He was at his desk on the base, in uniform, running briefings. Then, 6 weeks after the second tweet assault, he stopped leaving them alive. Marie-France Comeau was 37 years old, and she had built a life entirely on her own terms. She was francophone, born in Quebec, one of 3 children. She joined the Canadian Forces young and rose through the ranks without fuss. By 2009, she was a corporal with 437 Transport Squadron at CFB Trenton, a military flight attendant, which sounds domestic until you understand what the job actually involves. She flew on the aircraft that carried cabinet ministers and generals. She flew into Kandahar. She had done tours supporting operations in Afghanistan and in the Gulf, working out of Camp Mirage. She had been aboard the aircraft that brought Canadian dead home. She spoke 4 languages. She was known on the squadron as calm, unusually competent, and impossible to fluster. The person you wanted on board when the weather turned or the passenger manifest included someone important and difficult. She had a wide circle of friends. She had a boyfriend, a man named Paul Bélanger, who lived in Ottawa. She was, at that point in her life, entirely settled. She had also just been through a serious illness. She had beaten it. That autumn, she was flying again, back on the roster, back in the air. She owned a house in Brighton, Ontario, a small lakeside town about 15 miles west of the Trenton base. It was a modest place, quiet, set back from the road. She lived there alone, and she had flown with Russell Williams, not once and not by coincidence of a shared base. She had served aboard aircraft he commanded. She was aware of who he was, as every airman on that base was aware of who he was, because in July 2009, he had become the man whose name appeared at the bottom of every order. On November 16th, 2009, she was on days off. He entered the house through the basement. He had surveyed the property beforehand. He had been inside it before, on a break-in weeks earlier, taking photographs, taking underwear, learning the layout. He knew where the stairs were. He knew where the bedroom was. He waited in the basement in the dark for a period of time before going up. What happened over the next several hours was recorded by him on camera and later described in court in detail that does not need repeating here. She fought him. The physical evidence made that unambiguous. She fought him for a long time, and she nearly got free, and she asked him repeatedly not to kill her. He suffocated her. Then he cleaned. He removed items. He took what he had come for and he added it to the archive. Her body was found on November 25th when Paul Bélanger, unable to reach her for days, drove down from Ottawa and let himself into the house. The investigation that followed was competent and, in the end, useless. The Ontario Provincial Police and the Northumberland Detachment treated it as what it appeared to be, a single, catastrophic, isolated homicide. There was no obvious link to Tweed, different jurisdiction, different town, different offense class, and a gap of 6 weeks. Sexual assaults in a rural village and a murder in a lakeside town 25 miles away did not automatically join up in 2009 because they had not yet been joined by anyone with a reason to look. The case was worked through her life. Boyfriend, eliminated. Ex-partners, eliminated. Squadron colleagues, interviewed. Anyone with a grievance, anyone she had disciplined, anyone she had dated. The theory that dominated early was that she had been killed by someone she knew, because there was no forced entry that suggested a stranger and no theft that suggested a burglary. Investigators looked for the personal motive. It was not there. DNA was recovered. It was submitted. It matched nothing because it belonged to a man with no criminal record. Then came the detail that, in hindsight, sits at the exact center of this case. Marie-France Comeau was a serving member of the Canadian Forces, and she had died. That triggers a formal process. Her chain of command was required to write to her family. Her base commander wrote the letter. Russell Williams composed and signed a letter of condolence to her father, a document expressing the sorrow of the squadron, the loss to the Air Force, and his personal regret at the death of an outstanding airwoman. He wrote it 8 days after killing her. Her father kept it. He also attended to the administrative aftermath on the base. Her death was a matter of official business now, and he processed it the way he processed everything, correctly, thoroughly, without a visible tremor. Colleagues who worked beside him through that period noticed nothing at all. 2 months later, at the end of January, he drove out along Highway 37 north of Belleville. Jessica Lloyd was 27 and lived by herself in a small bungalow on Highway 37, a few miles north of Belleville. The house sat alone on the road, set back on a wide lot with open field behind it and a line of trees at the property edge. It was hers. She had bought it and she was proud of it. She had spent the previous year fixing it up piece by piece, painting rooms, planning a garden for the spring. She worked for a school bus company in Belleville, in the office. She was well liked there in the plain, uncomplicated way that people are well liked when they show up on time and cover other people's shifts. She had a large group of friends. She had a brother, Andy, who lived nearby. She had a mother, Roxanne, who was undergoing treatment for cancer and who Jessica saw constantly. She was the daughter who drove to appointments, who checked in, who called every day without being asked. She was, by the description of everyone who knew her, uncomplicated and warm and funny. She had no enemies. She had no dangerous ex-partner. She had no debts, no dispute, no secret. She was a young woman who worked, went to the gym, spent time with her family, and was rebuilding a small house on a country road. On the evening of Wednesday, January 27th, she had been out with a friend. She got home late. She spoke to her mother on the phone. She sent her last text message shortly after 10. Williams had been watching the house. He had driven past it. He had come out on foot across the field behind the property, in snow, in the dark, and he had stood outside her window and observed her through the glass while she used her exercise equipment. He returned later that night. He broke in through a window. He attacked her in her own home. He then forced her out of the house, into his vehicle, and drove her north, to his cottage in Tweed, about 25 miles up the road. She was held there for a number of hours. She was assaulted. She was killed on the morning of Thursday, January 28th. He took her body out and left it in a wooded area off a rural road not far from the cottage. And then he drove back to Ottawa and went to work. On Friday morning, January 29th, Jessica did not arrive at the bus company office. That was the first alarm, and it was immediate because Jessica Lloyd did not miss work and she did not fail to call. Her employer phoned her. Her friends phoned her. Nobody could raise her. Her mother could not raise her either, and Roxanne Lloyd knew, in the specific way that mothers know, that this was wrong within the first few hours. Andy Lloyd went to the house. The front door was locked. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was inside. Her cell phone was gone, but her keys were not. The bed was disturbed. There was a chair out of place and a lamp on the floor, and something about the room that was wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate. He called the police. The Ontario Provincial Police arrived that afternoon, and they did not treat it as a missing adult. They treated it as an abduction from the outset because the scene said, abduction, vehicle present, personal effects present, signs of struggle in the bedroom, no note, no packed bag, no reason on earth for a woman with a sick mother to walk out of her own house in January without her coat. What followed was the largest search operation the region had seen in decades. 200 officers were assigned. The OPP brought in aircraft, canine units, underwater search teams for the creeks and quarries. Snowmobiles went out across the fields. Volunteers turned up in numbers that overwhelmed the coordinators. Hundreds of people from Belleville and Tweed and Foxborough, walking lines through frozen scrub in temperatures well below freezing, in 15-mile-an-hour wind for days. Her photograph went up in every window on every main street in Hastings County. Her family stood in front of television cameras and asked whoever had her to let her go. And the region understood, all at once, what it was dealing with, because now the connection was public and obvious in a way it had not been in November. 2 women, 3 months, 25 miles apart, both taken from inside their own homes at night, both alone. Corporal Comeau's murder was suddenly not an isolated tragedy in Brighton. It was the first one. The fear that had been confined to Tweed spread outward across the whole corridor between Belleville and Trenton. Locksmiths were booked solid. Gun shops in the area reported a sharp increase in business. Women stopped sleeping alone in houses they had lived in for 20 years. Daughters moved back to their parents' homes. Friends organized nightly check-in calls. Parents at the schools in Tweed and Sterling were escorting teenagers door to door. People who had spent their whole lives in a place where nothing happened were now looking at the tree line behind the house and thinking about how much of it was open field, and how far away the nearest neighbor was, and how long a scream would carry. There was a predator operating in a 15-mile radius, and he had now taken 2 women out of their beds, and nobody had the faintest idea who he was. And then a police officer looked at a set of tire tracks in the snow. The first week of the Lloyd investigation went almost entirely the wrong way, and it went that way for defensible reasons. The working assumption was that the offender was transient or marginal. A man with a record, a man without a stable address, a man who had drifted into the corridor and would drift out of it. That assumption drove the resource allocation. Officers pulled the provincial sex offender registry for Eastern Ontario and worked through it name by name. They interviewed men with convictions for break and enter. They looked at recent parolees. They looked at anyone in the region with a history of confinement offenses. The tip line generated hundreds of calls in the first 72 hours, and the vast majority of them were noise, neighbors reporting neighbors, ex-wives reporting ex-husbands, sightings of Jessica in 3 provinces. Everyone had to be run down, because the one you skip is the one that mattered. Investigators looked hard at the people around her, the ex-boyfriend, male colleagues, a man she had recently spoken to online. All were worked and all were cleared. There was no personal motive because there was no personal connection. She had been selected by a stranger who had watched her through a window, and that is the single hardest category of crime to solve, because the investigative bridge between victim and offender does not exist. They also, for a period, seriously entertained the possibility that the Como and Lloyd cases were unrelated. Different towns, different jurisdictions, one victim military and one civilian, one killed in her house and one taken from it. Joining cases prematurely is a known way to destroy an investigation. It took direct comparison of the scenes to force the linkage. So by the first weekend of February, 10 days in, they had a region in panic, 200 officers deployed and no suspect. What they did have was the ground behind Jessica Lloyd's house. Snow is an unforgiving surface. Behind the bungalow, out toward the field, officers had photographed and cast 2 sets of impressions. The first was footwear, a distinctive boot tread, size 11, a Bakelite soled pattern consistent with a specific make. The second was better. A vehicle had pulled off the road and stopped near the property, and it had left tire impressions in fresh snow that were clean enough to identify by tread design. The tread came back as a Toyo open country tire, an all-terrain pattern not common, and one that shipped as an option on a limited set of SUVs. Crucially, the impressions gave the technicians a wheelbase measurement and a track width. The analysis narrowed it to a Nissan Pathfinder. That is a real lead, but it is a wide one. There are a great many Pathfinders in Eastern Ontario. So the OPP did the unglamorous thing, and it is the thing that broke the case. On the evening of Thursday, February 4th, 2010, they set up a roadside canvas on Highway 37 north of Belleville, a checkpoint on the same stretch of road where Jessica lived, positioned to catch drivers who habitually used that route at that hour on that day of the week. The logic was straightforward. A man who was watching that house had driven that road, probably more than once, probably at the same time of day. Officers stopped every vehicle. They asked drivers where they were going and whether they had seen anything. They wrote down names and plates. They looked at the vehicles. Just after 9 o'clock, a Nissan Pathfinder came down the highway toward the checkpoint. It was in poor shape for a February in Ontario. The driver had apparently been driving in deep snow. An officer approached the driver's window and began the standard questions. The man behind the wheel was middle-aged, entirely composed, and completely cooperative. He gave his name. He said he was driving to his cottage in Tweed. He answered everything. The officer, working through the checklist, walked around the vehicle. He crouched at the front tire. Toyo Open Country, the same tread pattern that was sitting in a cast in an evidence locker in Belleville. The officer did not arrest him. There was no basis to. He recorded the plate, the name, and the driver's license details, told him to have a good evening, and let him drive north to Tweed. Back at the command post, the details went into the system. Registered owner, David Russell Williams. Address in Orleans, Ottawa. Occupation on file, Canadian Forces. The investigators looked at that entry, and their first reaction was that it had to be wrong. Not because the tire was wrong, but because the man attached to it was the base commander at CFB Trenton. He had zero criminal history. He had a security clearance most of the officers in the room would never qualify for. He had flown the Queen. But the tread was the tread. And there was one other thing that stopped the conversation cold. The boot impression from behind Jessica Lloyd's house was consistent with military-issue footwear. They ran the address in Tweed, Cozy Cove Lane, 2 doors from a 2007 break-in, inside the cluster of Tweed sexual assaults, 25 miles from Brighton. The investigation stopped being about a drifter. 3 days later, they asked Colonel Williams if he would come in for an interview. He came voluntarily. He drove himself. Sunday, February 7th, 2010. Ottawa, a small interview room at OPP headquarters on Elgin Street. A table, 3 chairs, a camera in the corner, running continuously. Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the OPP Behavioral Sciences Unit sat down across from him. Smith was a polygraph examiner and interrogation specialist. He was polite, unhurried, and slightly deferential. He addressed the man in front of him by rank. Williams arrived in civilian clothes. He was calm. He had not brought a lawyer. He was told, correctly, that he was free to leave at any time. And that framing mattered enormously because everything that followed had to be voluntary to survive a courtroom. The interview ran roughly 4 hours. It is now studied in police colleges across North America. Smith began with context rather than accusation. He explained the tire impressions. He explained the boot prints. He explained, without pressure, that the vehicle in the tracks behind Jessica Lloyd's house was a Pathfinder and that the colonel drove one. He asked whether there was an innocent explanation. Williams offered general denials in a measured, professional register, the tone of an officer answering questions in a briefing. He said he did not know Jessica Lloyd. He said he had no involvement. Smith did not argue with him. He did something more effective. He laid the evidence down one piece at a time, in order, and let the man on the other side of the table do the arithmetic himself. He told him a boot print had been recovered. He told him the boots on his feet, which he had worn into the building, would be compared to it. He told him that his DNA sample, which Williams had provided voluntarily on arrival, was going to be compared against samples from the Tweed assaults and the Comeau homicide, and that this comparison would take a matter of hours, not weeks. He told him plainly that his vehicle was being searched and his house in Orleans was being searched at that moment. Then he stopped talking about evidence altogether and began talking about consequences. He told the colonel that his wife was about to have police in her home, that the search of the Orleans house would take days and would be visible to every neighbor on the street, that whatever was in the house would be found regardless of what happened in this room, that the only remaining variable was Jessica Lloyd's body, that her mother did not know where her daughter was, and that this was the one thing still within the colonel's power to give. There was a long silence in the room. Williams asked, quietly, whether they had a map. That was the collapse. It arrived without drama, no shouting, no breakdown, no theatrics. He asked how to minimize the impact on his wife. Smith said the only way to do that was to start telling the truth, and then, for the next several hours, he did. He confessed to the murder of Jessica Lloyd. He confessed to the murder of Marie-France Comeau. He confessed to the 2 sexual assaults in Tweed. He then began describing the break-ins, and the number kept climbing. First, a handful, then dozens. Then a figure that stunned the officers listening, because none of them had understood the scale of what had been running underneath the region for 2.5 years. He drew a map. He marked a spot on a rural road north of Belleville, near Cary Road, and described the terrain well enough for a search team to work with. Officers were dispatched in the dark. Jessica Lloyd's body was recovered on February 8, 2010, in a wooded area a short distance from the road, several miles from his cottage. Her family was told that morning. He was charged that day with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of forcible confinement, 2 counts of sexual assault. The break-and-enter charges, 82 of them, came later. The searches ran for weeks. At the house on Wilkie Drive in Orleans, officers found the archive: hard drives, external drives, memory cards, thousands upon thousands of photographs and video files, indexed by address and date. They found the written logs. They found the video he had recorded of the assaults and the killings, which he had reviewed. In the garage, in the rafters, they found the stolen underwear, hundreds of items, bagged and labeled, from dozens of victims, some of them children. At the cottage on Cozy Cove Lane, they found more, along with the physical evidence of what had happened to Jessica Lloyd there. Investigators who worked the digital material required counseling. Several never returned to that unit. His wife, who had been at home when the police arrived, was interviewed extensively. There was never any evidence that she knew. The material had been kept where she did not look: the crawl space, the rafters, encrypted folders on drives she had no reason to open. She had been married to him for 19 years. The proceedings opened in Belleville on October 18, 2010, in a courthouse surrounded by satellite trucks. He pleaded guilty to all 88 charges. There was no trial and no defense argument. His counsel entered the pleas and sat down. The Crown then spent 4 days presenting an agreed statement of facts, illustrated with his own photographs and video, projected in a courtroom that emptied and refilled as people found they could not stay. The victim impact statements ran for hours. Roxanne Lloyd told the court what it was to bury a daughter who had been holding her together through cancer treatment. Marie-France Comeau's father spoke about the letter of condolence he had received, signed by the man in the prisoner's box, and about what it had meant to him at the time. On October 21st, Williams was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms with no possibility of parole for 25 years, plus consecutive terms on the assaults and the break-ins. He was 47. The Canadian forces moved quickly and absolutely. His commission was terminated. He was stripped of his rank. His medals and service decorations were destroyed. His uniform was burned. The military took the extraordinary step of erasing him from the institutional record wherever it legally could. The objective was not punishment, but disassociation, a formal declaration that this had never been one of theirs. The cottage on Cozy Cove Lane was later demolished. Jessica Lloyd's house was sold and the property changed hands. Mary Elizabeth Harriman legally changed her name and disappeared from public life. Compensation was paid, quietly, to the surviving victims. He was sent to Kingston Penitentiary, then to a maximum security unit in Quebec, held in segregation for his own protection. He has never explained it. In 4 hours of confession, he gave the police everything: the addresses, the dates, the burial site, the count. He gave them the archive. He answered every factual question put to him with the same precision he brought to a flight log. And when they asked him why, he said he did not know. Psychiatrists were never granted the access to test it. No trial meant no defense, no expert testimony, no diagnosis entered into the record. What remains is a man who spent 23 years being exactly what the paperwork said he was, and who, somewhere underneath that, kept a second set of files. 2 women are dead. 2 more survived him. Dozens of homes in eastern Ontario were entered by a man who then went to work and signed the orders. The uniform was burned. The question was not. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.